All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this week's installment of the Extending Empathy Project. Tonight, you'll be hearing from Dr. Dan Lannin from the Department of Psychology, and his talk is entitled Exercising Empathy, Strengthening Our Ability to Empathize Effectively. My name is Dr. Nathan Carpenter. I will be performing the technical direction for this evening's talk. And as you are watching, if you have comments or questions, we ask that you start by putting them in the chat if you are participating on Zoom. And if you are watching live on YouTube, feel free to put responses right there in the live chat, and we will get to those as soon as we can. After the talk, we'll raise those questions directly to Dr. Lannin. And if we get to a certain point that you prefer to ask your question directly, we will open it up for response and conversation. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Scott Jordan, who will introduce the Extending Empathy Project.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carpenter. I'm Dr. Scott Jordan, and on behalf of the faculty, students, and staff of the Department of Psychology, it's my extreme pleasure to welcome you to our next talk in the Extending Empathy Project on the road to Tulsa. Before I start to describe what the Extending Empathy Project actually is, it's important we take a moment to express our condemnation of the ongoing racial violence occurring in the United States. Dante Wright should be alive. Lieutenant Coron Nazario should have been treated with respect. And members of the Asian American Pacific Islander community, no members of any community, should live in fear of racial violence. Now, this project actually started in 2018 when I sent out a call to faculty and graduate students in the Department of Psychology to participate in a project of some sort that would allow us to work to create a more empathetic environment in our department and in the university environment. During that first year, we were able to provide 10 colloquia for the university community. And then last year, we were only able to offer 4 talks, given we were in the midst of a pandemic. And while discussing the project, my colleagues, Dr. Byron Craig, Dr. Nathan Carpenter, and Dr. Steve Hunt, decided that we needed to come up with some alternative programming, June 20th, 2020, at 7 p.m. Central Time. My colleagues Byron Craig and Steve Rako gave this fantastic talk, What Should Empathy Be Like in This Moment of Historical Reckoning, Reconciling Black Trauma, Whiteness, and the Historical Structure of Racism since 1619. This talk was a smashing success, and we immediately knew we needed to organize another series for this year. So far, we've given 4 talks, and tonight is our 5th. All of these talks are available on YouTube at the locations indicated in the flyer Dr. Carpenter has posted in the chat. The series picks up tonight with our next colloquium and ends for the year with a talk given by Drs. Byron Craig and Stephen Rako on Tuesday, June 1st, in commemoration of the Tulsa Massacre of 1921. Now, it's our hope that over the course of this series, we can collectively come to understand an approach to empathy that does not shy away from the hard, important choices we need to make in this country about wealth, equity, and opportunity, and their relationship to diversity, inclusion, and justice. And now it is my extreme pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Stephen Hunt, Director of the School of Communication here at Illinois State University.
Thank you, Dr. Jordan. And the School of Communication is extremely proud to work with the Department of Psychology and all of our colleagues there in presenting the Extending Empathy Project. We owe a huge debt of gratitude to Dr. Carpenter for taking care of all the technical duties and making sure that the show is up and running and everything's functioning correctly. So thank you, Dr. Carpenter. Of course, Dr. Byron Craig, along with Dr. Jordan, we are looking into expanding the Extending Empathy Project through the National American Democracy Project so that we might be able to take this initiative to the 250 or so institutions that are affiliated with the National ADP. And in that line, we thank Dean Diane Zosky for supporting this work, and Dr. Felice Noodleman, who's the Executive Director of the National American Democracy Project. So having said all of that, it's now my pleasure to turn things over to Dr. Byron Craig to provide an intro of tonight's speaker.
Good evening, everyone. And as always, I have to start by naming our lost brothers and sisters. So I say, I remember Dante Wright this evening. So Dan Lannin joined the clinical counseling psychology program in August 2016. He completed a BA in philosophy and religion at Hope College and a master's in divinity at Western Theological Seminary. After working in ministry in New York, California, and Colorado, Lannin returned to school to take post-baccalaureate courses in psychology at the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs before earning his MS and PhD in psychology from Iowa State University. Dan's research broadly investigates factors that enhance people's lives with three primary areas. One, identifying and mitigating barriers to seeking help. Two, understanding factors that influence mental health and well-being. And third, examining the different factors that influence the quality and stability of interpersonal relationships. Dr. Lannin's clinical areas of expertise center around the treatment of anxiety and depressive disorders in individual and interpersonal process group theory. He currently teaches clinical counseling master's students counseling skills, and he has taught helping skills workshops to undergraduates, residential advisors, and faculty and staff at ISU. So Dr. Lannin, I turn it over to you.
All right, well, thanks very much. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. And, you know, we got a nice cozy group. I'm not actually in my office. This is all a mirage. Nice cozy group. So I'm okay if you've got something you want to interrupt with. The one rule is it has to be funny. So that's the only thing. Okay, so it doesn't have to be funny. It could also be serious or boring, I guess. So let's talk about empathy and particularly viewing empathy in a slightly different way, not just viewing it as something you have or you don't, but seeing it as a skill which we can develop. And obviously some people are born with more talent in this area than others. You know, a lot of times our family of origin influences our ability to empathize to a different degree, but I think it really is a skill. And let's start off with this way. I'm going to ask you a few different questions. And, you know, don't answer out loud. I don't want anyone to feel shame or to feel, you know, superior. So here's some of the questions. So just kind of answer them silently to yourself. Have you ever done this? You meet a new person and within 30 seconds forget their name. Or have you ever, in a conversation, you can't remember what the person just said because you were thinking about what you were going to say? Or have you ever responded to a person's negative story by trying to get them to see the positive of their situation rather than sort of help them to express the negative thing that they're feeling? Or have you ever, when a person tells you they're struggling, your first instinct is to give them advice on how to solve the problem that you've so easily identified? And finally, or have you ever, if you respond by telling a 10-minute story that it reminded you of, and wait, what were they talking about again? So have you ever made it about yourself? So we've got some bad news and some good news. Did you answer yes to any of those questions? If you did, here's the bad news. You suck. I'm just kidding. That's not true. What it actually means is if you answered yes, you are a human being, because none of us are perfect at empathy. We all have our empathy lapses. We all are human beings. We cannot be amazing listeners, empathetic resonators all of the time. So in fact, you don't need to be a pro or to be perfect at empathy to make a difference. There's lots of non-professional helpers out there and a burgeoning literature which looks at that. They're used more and more. They do things like provide support, provide empathy, provide listening. They can actually be as effective as prose when it comes to those things. So providing support, empathy, listening, non-professional helpers, even trained college students can be really effective. Sometimes even more effective than professionals when it comes to some of those basic empathy skills. One of the things we find in literature is that practice increases self-efficacy. And self-efficacy basically means your self-confidence in your ability to do a particular activity. So the more you practice listening, the more you practice being an accurate empathizer, the better you become at it, the more confident you are in it. And the more confident you are in your abilities, the better you actually are, and the less stress you experience while you're doing it. So my central idea with this talk is that empathy can be exercised, is that the more we practice being the skills of empathy, the better at it we can become. If we don't practice it at all, or think, oh, I've got this, we might not be as empathetic as we think we are. And so it's like anything, it needs to be exercised. It's one of the things I appreciate getting to teach a helping skills class once a year. I get reminded every single year of these fundamentals. And when, you know what, every single year I realize, wow, there's parts of these fundamentals I can still work on. And so I think it's an important, just as we wouldn't stop physically exercising, we don't want to necessarily stop exercising something we care about, like the virtue of empathy. So what is it? Well, first of all, the accuracy of empathy seems to matter. So how accurate are we in our ability to empathize? And in case you're wondering, you might see the word empathic or empathetic. Empathic's just the older term, but they're essentially equivalent. And if you're unsure if that's correct, just go ahead and Google it. I know in academia, sometimes these little things matter. They matter to me when I'm writing papers and things like that. So how accurately a person can infer the thoughts and feelings of another person. This is sort of the definition of empathetic accuracy, and it comes from this idea that empathy is kind of like everyday mind reading. And this might bring to your minds, Star Trek and the empath who's able to sort of do this. Now, we don't have to have special abilities to do this, but the more skills we develop, the better we become at sort of inferring what's going on inside of other people. And so our working definition of empathy, which I'd like to use for this talk, is just this idea of the ability to sense and understand another person's experiences and feelings. And then the second part is to be able to convey the fact that you understand that. So it's not just being able to mind read in an everyday sense with people, but to let them know, like, I understand what you're experiencing. Without that communication back to someone who's speaking, they really don't know. And so it's not just a passive process. And here's kind of a formal definition from some of the early work into empathy. So, and if you're curious about, like, what's the difference between sympathy and empathy, and compassion and empathy, slightly different constructs. We could have a whole nother talk on that. But if you're interested, there's some literature you can look into. So what does an empathetic person look like? I think anytime we're learning something, it's important to have models that we follow. If you're learning how to play basketball, of course you want to follow Michael Jordan and, be like Mike and that sort of thing. And if we want to be empathetic, it's helpful to sort of have an idea in our head of what we could become if we were to sort of reach our full potential in this area. And so there was some cool work done in the late 60s, looking at the empathetic person. And what this particular study did by Hogan is they had some experts, some psychologists, graduate students, I believe they were at the University of California, Berkeley. They were looking and doing this sorting of different traits, and they had 100 different traits they were sorting around, and they had all the experts say, well, which are the traits of an empathetic person of this list of traits? And they found 5, which kind of seemed to be the most empathetic people. They seem to be aware of the impression they make on others. They have insight into their own motives and behaviors. An empathetic person, socially perceptive of a wide range of interpersonal cues. They're skilled in social techniques of imaginative play, pretending, and humor. They evaluate the motivation of others and interpreting situations. And so, you look at this and you see, well, what kind of themes are there here? Certain things might kind of seem to stick out. One of the things which stuck out to me was just that there's kind of what we call in psychology intrapersonal, which means within yourself, and then interpersonal, which means like between yourself and others. And I just highlighted the yellow, which is kind of the intrapersonal aspects of empathy, right? So there has to be some sort of self-awareness and self-insight in addition to other insight. So it's not just about others, but it's this complex interaction between how you understand yourself and how you understand others. And then the same study used the same process to sort of imagine what the least empathetic person looked like. And I think this gives us insight into what we don't want to become if you want to be more empathetic. And extra punitive, meaning they punish others. So the least empathetic person is likely to transfer or project blame onto others. They're going to handle anxiety and conflict by denial or pushing that anxiety and conflict down rather than experiencing it. They're going to judge themselves and others in conventional terms like popularity, the correct thing to do, social pressures, that sort of thing. I think this one you could unpack for a whole book, right? Why some of these conventional terms might not lead us to really understand what's going on inside of a person. It also reminds me of Tolstoy's short novel, The Death of Ivan Ilyich. The least empathetic people, they're going to be uncomfortable with uncertainty and complexities, right? They're going to want to put people in boxes for their own sake of understanding, not necessarily because that's what the other person requires. And they do not vary roles. They relate to everyone in the same way. So there's a sense that with empathy, we need to be flexible and recognize that people require some individuation. Some people need a little something more. Some people need, a different type of attention than others. And if you've worked with kids or have kids, sometimes you see this is true, right? It's hard you want to be fair, but you also want to acknowledge that people are unique and people have their own needs. And again, we kind of see some themes, themes around how you manage your own sort of anxiety or your own sort of baggage. And then, so intrapersonal issues, and then extra or interpersonal issues kind of being highlighted in white. And I really think that Brene Brown does a great job of highlighting what empathy looks like. And so we're going to just watch a short video. This is on YouTube. If you look up Brene Brown, I think it does a great job of capturing empathy. And Nathan, let me know if the sound doesn't work. Hopefully it does.
So what is empathy and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, I'm down. I know what it's like down here and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. I had it, yeah. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
I love that line. What makes something better is connection. All right, that was dramatic. Double dramatic. All right, so it's all about connection. And we know this from a whole swath of literature, not just in psychology, but in philosophy and the humanities, great fiction, that human connections intrinsically rewarding, meaningful, and even healing. And I could have cited a whole slew of other work. And so learning how to do that connection effectively is important. And it's the work of empathy. And so one of the things that we learned from the ancient Greeks was that these virtues, they don't just happen to us, but they're skills that we need to work on. They're traits, characteristics that we can invest in, that can become habits. And so some of the virtues, the things that are related to empathy and connection, self-awareness and self-reflection, being aware of who you are, being aware of your biases, being aware of those things in your personality and those things in your sort of immediate thoughts, which are empathy barriers. And these are things which are about you and maybe not about the person that you're trying to empathize with. Self-regulation, being able to handle the anxiety and the conflict without getting defensive, being able to handle uncertainty in a conversation or not knowing something about someone without having to come to a conclusion instantly. And then there's social intelligence. The things I'm highlighting in yellow are the things that Brene Brown mentioned in the video. Being able to take the perspective of another, being able to accept people and not judge them, being able to listen, and being able to communicate that you are listening. And then emotional intelligence. So, being able to recognize emotions in others. So knowing what emotions are, knowing what they're like when you have them, knowing what the function of those emotions are. These are some things people intuitively do, and other people are more intentional about it. But recognizing emotions in others, communicating that you are recognizing that emotion, and then effective resonance, which is feeling to a degree, feeling the same feeling that someone else is going through. That can be really helpful and meaningful. I had a wise supervisor who once said, connection is all about shared emotion. And I had to really think about that one. But I think that's true. Sharing an emotion with someone builds a connection, which you see it at sporting events, you see it with people at the coffee shop. And you also see when there's disconnect, when people aren't sharing emotions, what that can lead to. Carl Rogers, one of the pioneers of counseling, notes that he sort of looked at these virtues in a slightly different way, but they kind of correspond in a way. 3 things which are related to these healing connections, these healing relationships. A sense of genuineness, that someone is who they say they are. They're not putting up facades. A sense of unconditional positive regard, which doesn't mean unconditional love, but it does mean that you accept the person and you're able to separate behaviors you don't like from their personality. And then accurate empathy, which is a sense that you put in the effort to understand what someone's experiencing. And I say put in the effort because it's not, none of us are telepathic. It takes effort to actually unearth what's going on inside of other people. And so let's simplify. Empathy toward yourself is kind of a first step, the ability to sense and understand what's going on inside of you. And then empathy toward others. And that's what's going on inside of other people. And I added without trying to judge or change them too much, because I think that's an important part. As soon as we're starting to try to change people when we're listening to them, we're not empathizing with them. We're guiding them. We're leading them. We're influencing them. And that's a different thing. So what does it mean to listen empathetically? We're talking about hospitality, creating an inviting space, and accurate effective resonance, and also an accurate imaginative simulation is going on inside. And so I'd like to kind of get a little more practical for the rest of my talk for the last 15 minutes and talk about some of these specific skills, and I'll end with some exercises, some things you can try out, test for yourself and see if it works or not. So the first idea is that listening is hospitality, and so inviting and attending are important parts of this idea. And so inviting, we can't assume that others will just participate. If you go over to someone's house, typically you have to be invited first. And a good guest will sort of wait for the host to lead them through the script of what to do. They're not just going to go into the fridge and start eating stuff on their own. So a good host needs to invite others to participate, asking them, would you be willing to share, that sort of idea. And they can say no. We can't assume that they need to participate. We can't assume that we deserve for them to express themselves in front of us, right? So an invitation always understands that it's just an invitation. So some of the things with nonverbals, these are things you've probably come across. Open posture is helpful. So, having open arms, generally making eye contact when you're listening, especially, can be very important. It's hard over Zoom because you're often like, what do I look at? Do I look at the camera? Do I look at the screen? Am I supposed to be looking at? Ways you can kind of practice some of these nonverbals, inviting and attending skills. One is simply looking at the mirror. One of the things we do in the courses I teach are video recordings, so people can watch what it's like when they're when they're listening, when they're doing these helping skills. We can also ask for feedback from others. This can be a little tricky at times, of course, but you know, with a good, honest person, sometimes they'll let you know, yeah, you interrupt a lot, or you know, or that sort of thing. So some 4 basic skills. We'll just kind of go over restatements, reflections, summarizing, and questions, and I'll kind of offer some tips, things I've learned from teaching these helping skills class, things I've learned from doing this myself, you know, through counseling. Restatements, this is really an important one, and this is repeating or paraphrasing what you hear. It's so important. Think of it as the bread and butter of listening, or even better, think of it as wine, like wine and cooking. Restatements would be things like, you know, someone shares a story of, you know, I was going to the grocery store and I ran into my friend. Oh, and you say, oh, you ran into your friend. It's that simple. It's just repeating or paraphrasing what you hear. It's like wine and cooking. Some is good, more is better. Theoretically, you could have too much, but I've never seen it. Restatements are the same way. Theoretically, you could do too much. I've rarely seen it. Empathetic listeners do this a lot. If you know someone who really gets you and who really listens well, chances are they're doing lots of restatements. It requires a big commitment, though, from people to do this, because you have to set aside your own ego and really follow what's going on for that other person. So it's not as easy as it looks. And the cool thing is, and there's literature which shows that counselors who do a lot of this, this is the best predictor of counselees' impression of their therapist, or therapist, apparently, I don't know how to spell. So the more we do restatements, the more people, the more we're following them, and the more people feel like we're following them. So I often get this question in class, is it okay to just repeat what they said? And I usually answer like, sure, but you know, of course it can sound robotic. And if that's all you ever do, you know, you could probably design a computer program to do the same thing. But I would say the more you interpret what people say, the further you can be venturing away from what they're aware of that they're actually thinking or feeling. So you might have a brilliant interpretation, but it might not resonate with the person who's speaking. And so the more we paraphrase, the more we interpret when we're restating something, you know, it's a little bit riskier. Reflections are basically a restatement, but it has to do with the feeling. And so these are things that you do where if you hear someone speaking and you hear a feeling coming across, or you sort of sense that there's a feeling, you sort of acknowledge that the feeling exists. It sounds like you're feeling angry, or sounds like, boy, that's sad. It's more intimate. It's not something that, you know, necessarily rings as appropriate, like at the grocery line, you know, standing in line at the grocery store, like, oh, sounds like you're feeling angry. You didn't get that Snickers bar. That seems a little awkward, right? But with people we know more, reflections can feel more natural. Like I said, not always appropriate, but it is kind of also the definition of empathy, right? Reflecting people, their feelings back. Because you're basically saying, here's what I think you're feeling. And that's beautiful, because if it's not, they can correct you and say, no, I'm not feeling sad. I'm feeling angry. And then you say, okay, angry. Is it angry? Yeah. Oh, I got it. Okay, now you're on track. Right? The ability to sense and understand another person's experiences and feelings. Summarizing is like restating as well. It's just tying together several restatements and reflections. This is sort of touching base periodically. Am I following what you're saying? Is this making sense? Let me make sure I'm following. This can be helpful for a lot of people. Especially helpful for folks who tend to be what you'd call like an anxious talker, someone who just fills up the space and maybe they're not even knowing where they're going. It can sort of be helpful to summarize every now and then. Right? Oh, like an example. Oh, she stood up, which made you mad, and now you don't want her to be your friend anymore. Something as simple as that can sort of help people know you're tracking with them. So why do these things? Why mention these skills, which seem so basic? Why practice the fundamentals? Well, why practice the fundamentals of anything? Because it helps you do more advanced techniques better. And there's core reasons for these fundamentals and why they're linked to empathy. Number one, they encourage other people to talk. So you do restatements, you do reflections, people keep talking. It holds a mirror up so they can hear what they're saying, so that you can empathize with them, but they can also sort of empathize with themselves and get a sense of what's going on inside. What a gift that can be to people. It can be validating, right? They say, here's who I am, here's what I'm feeling, and you say, I'm hearing that, and that's okay. It also builds trust and rapport. The more you do it, the more people trust you. They feel rapport with you. It allows for calibration and correction. So when you restate and you reflect, people can correct you and say, no, that's not actually what I meant. If you didn't restate and reflect, they can't correct you. You might just be stuck with an inaccurate sense of who they are and what they're experiencing. And that's not empathy. Empathy is, or accurate empathy, is when you're getting it right. And so that's why it's important to do these things. You can calibrate your understanding. Some observations and tips that I've made. Restatements show that you're listening. You can tell someone, I'm listening, but just like good writing, it's better to show than it is to tell. Restatements don't have to be full sentences. They can be real simple, like, oh, just a phrase or a word. Reflections too. So they don't have to be complicated. Could just be capturing something really simple. You don't need to say anything after you restate or reflect. You can just let the restatement be there. Sometimes that silence can be helpful. Sometimes a lot happens in that silence. Sometimes people are thinking about what's going on for them. Sometimes it's not as awkward as we think. If you focus on restatements too and reflections, these summaries and things like that, you don't need to worry about saying brilliant things. You don't need to come up with brilliant questions. You can actually listen, which I think is an important idea. So what about questions? Questions are also important. One of the things that I notice a lot of my beginning helpers, one of their sort of things that they deal with is they tend to ask too many questions and do less of the restatements and less of the reflections because they're used to asking questions. They're maybe less used to restating and reflecting. They have lots of functions. Here's a few, right? You can gather information, you can understand things, you can encourage someone to share more, you can challenge someone. Challenging someone's one of my some of the rabbinic questionings where the rabbis will answer a question with a question. Just gives you an example of how cool questions can be and all the different functions they pose. Some of the consequences of questions, though, interpersonally, is they tend to invite a particular response or direct a conversation. And so, I think it's important to be intentional with questions. It also puts the focus on the other person. Which, is good, but some people don't want the focus on them. And so when we ask too many questions, sometimes it can make people uncomfortable. It gives them pressure. It can also, of course, elicit insight. Nothing like a good question to get people thinking about an area that they haven't thought about before. And it can also prompt action, get them to be aware of a discrepancy between who they currently are and what they want to become. So questions can prompt action as well. When people start asking questions, a lot of times it's very easy for us to kind of by default go to closed-ended questions. I find these are of limited helpfulness with empathy-oriented conversations. They're very useful in certain contexts. Typically, you're going to ask a closed question if you start with the word did, do, were, or have, right? Did you fill up the car with gas? Do you like going to school? Were you there last Friday? Have you ever tried? These are all things which people can answer with a simple yes or no. And they're good for gathering facts. And they're great for satisfying our own curiosity. But if we want to ask a closed-ended or open-ended question, we're going to want to start with how, when, what, or why. And I particularly think how questions are underrated. How are you dealing with this, right? How did you do that? It gets people thinking about the process of their life, which is something that they're not often asked. Now, open-ended question or closed-ended questions often force people into answering one way or another. And so, they often used in court, were you there on Friday night? And they already know the answer, of course, or else they wouldn't be asking. One of the problems, though, is it can elicit defensiveness or shame. Whether if you're asking something about a good behavior, did you go to the gym? Oh, shoot, I didn't. No. Maybe an open-ended question would be like, what's it been like when you've been exercising? Which is more, doesn't elicit the shame, still gets people to reflect on the general idea. Open-ended questions, like I said, these start with how, when, what, or why. How did that make you feel? You've heard this cliche likely. This is a therapy cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason. It's got all the ingredients of a great exploratory question. It asks about the process, it connects to feelings, and it's open-ended, so people are not sort of forced into one response or the other. Another great question, if you don't want to ask the cliche question, is what was it like for you when, right? So someone says, oh, just ran into Susan. Well, what was it like for you seeing her? Great question. Tell me more is another great question. Technically not a question, technically a command. But, so you don't want to say it like a jerk. You want to say it in a nice, gentle way. Oh, tell me more. It's basically saying, I'd like to hear more about what you're doing. Would you mind telling me more if you want it to be a formally worded question? Why questions can be tricky. They can often elicit defensiveness. Why did you eat the cookie? Sort of, even though you might want to get some insight from people, often can be better just to reword it. What are some of the reasons? And I say some of the reasons because let's assume that people have multiple reasons. It's not just one thing. I see I'm getting close on time. I'm just going to eat up another 3 or 4 minutes if that's okay. Some observations and tips. Questions directed conversation. So often, maybe just ask yourself, why am I asking this? Too many questions can feel like an interview. And people don't want insider advice until they know that you've got some empathy. So I'll end on this before we kind of open it up to your questions and comments and all sorts of stuff. Here's just 6 things to practice. 1, read fiction. There's some great work out there. People who read fiction develop their empathy skills, particularly their ability to do perspective taking. And I think this is a skill which we need to fight for in our culture, to really promote this idea that we can put ourselves in other shoes. Practice restatements and reflections. Try them out. Just see what it's like to add a restatement with your romantic partner or with a friend. See what it feels like. See how they react and respond. Try all these things out for yourself. Don't just take my word for it. Test it out yourself and see how it works for you. See what happens when you primarily ask open-ended questions. If you're one of those closed-ended questions folks, see if it changes your relationships at all. Maybe it will. Maybe it won't. Maybe people will respond in a less defensive way. Try allowing a couple seconds before responding. Now, there's some cultures out there where this is kind of the norm, particularly when we look in some of the Eastern Asian countries. There will often be some silence in between one person talking and the next person responding. Less so in the United States. But people tend to talk more when you delay speaking. So providing space for people is sometimes all that they need. I always recommend people try therapy to get in touch with their emotions. If you've never done therapy, try to find a good therapist who is well and knowledgeable in the world of emotions, and can help you sort of get in touch with emotions that you might be struggling with, or emotions which are hard for you to deal with. And then practice mindfulness. There's some new research out there which shows that one of the ways that mindfulness is connected with empathy is it reduces our judgment. It reduces particularly an important type, which is the judgment of ourselves. So this paper by Wei and colleagues found that the more mindful helpers tended to have less of this sort of hindering, like this self-awareness where they like think about themselves too much. And so this mindfulness can sort of help buffer against that and help us to be more present. All right, so we'll stop there, and I'll kind of follow the lead from our organizers as to what we're to do next.
Thank you very much, Dan. And yeah, we'd like to take this opportunity that if you do have questions, that feel free to put those in the chat. And I will also look around the Zoom room and see if anyone has their hand raised or would like to ask any directly. And I do see some applause there. Yep.
Thank you. That's my thumbs up. Thank you.
And actually, it looks like Dr. Jordan has his hand up for the first question.
It was a very nice talk, Dr. Lannin. I did mean to raise my hand before I clapped, so you implied some correlations early on in your talk, relationship between self-awareness and empathy, and a relationship between one's level of empathy and the need for certainty. And I'm wondering if there are any data on those correlations. Is it truly the case that from a measurement perspective that those who are more self-aware also are more empathetic, and that those who are more empathetic have less of a need for certainty?
That's a great question. I don't know the scientific literature. That's more knowledge from clinical experience and supervisors I've had who've encouraged those sorts of facets. So I couldn't, I mean, I could make up an answer and say, sure there is, but that wouldn't be honest. I do know there's some link between like one of the constructs of need for closure. So people who have a strong need for closure tend to struggle with empathy a little bit more. But a lot of times these are tough studies to do because you can do a self-report on how empathetic are you, but that could really differ from the person receiving it. And that's actually one of the things we do notice in the counseling literature is that there's often a big discrepancy between how a counselor views a session going and how their client views it going. And that's why it's so important to check in with people to get reality checks of, am I actually empathizing with you or not?
And there is a question in the chat right now. Jean asks, is there a way to know when you've been empathetic?
Oh my goodness, Gene, that's a tough question. I don't know. I don't know if there is a way to know for sure. I mean, I can tell you from my experience doing counseling that people will tell you, if they trust you, you can know, right? So if they trust you, they will give you the feedback about whether or not they feel like you've been empathetic with them. And so I, often will just really reiterate to folks, like, please give me feedback. But if they don't trust you, you might never know, right? Because people, especially if there's power differential, or if they're just not sure about you, you know, they're just gonna leave. They're just gonna avoid you. They might not say, oh yeah, you really don't get me, or you really do get me. Or they might say, you really get me, just to get you out of there. So there's never a clear way. I'm kind of curious what you think, though. That was a really good question. Oh, I don't know if she can talk.
Oh, yeah, I can go ahead and unmute her.
Thanks.
Yep.
Thank you. It sounds to me like certainly communication helps a lot, like, yeah, maybe to try to figure out from someone, is this what you're trying to say, or is this how you feel?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I just wondered if you ever had a feeling like, oh, wow, I think I've been empathetic with this person. Yeah.
I mean, I personally have with lots of people, and I'm never 100% sure, because you can never really be inside someone's head. You can never go full Deanna Troy. But yeah, it feels very intimate when you truly empathize with the person. Yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and I see that Jeff has his hand raised, and
I think Jillian did too.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, I'll start with Jeff, and then we'll jump to Jillian.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. Sometimes younger counselor trainees struggle with how they can provide people who have had experiences that they've never had. Someone who is depressed says, well, you can't possibly know what it's like to be as depressed as I am. What's your sort of go-to advice for trainees in that situation?
What's the go-to advice for trainees? Well, I think that's a great question. What are the limits of your empathy? I think it's okay to admit that you can't completely empathize with a person's situation, right? Not everyone has, well, you can never know exactly what it's like to be another person. Even if they're your identical twin, there's still going to be some things that they've experienced that you haven't. So I think acknowledging that there are limits to empathy is an important part too. I don't know if that's what you were getting at, but I think we can closely approximate what people are experiencing while also acknowledging it's never completely true. So you don't have to be, certainly psychologists don't have to have experienced every single problem with their clients. If they would, we'd be messes. Arguably a lot of us are anyway. But you don't have to have gone through every single thing to be able to resonate with some of the pain. Core feelings like sadness, pain, shame, nervousness, anger, annoyance, frustration, these are core experiences that I think we can relate to. The circumstances differ, the intensities of the emotions differ. But I think that we're resonating with, you know, we might have different instruments, but we have similar strings. Gillian, you had a question?
I did. And this is one is this a question? I'm not really sure. My question is about how to have empathetic conversations in a large group. Dr. Craig brought up, the murder of Dante Wright in the beginning of today's conversation. And tomorrow when I see my students, I have several students of color, and want to address it with them, don't want to ignore it and not talk about it. How do you have empathetic? A lot of what we talked about today was kind of one-on-one empathy. How do you have empathetic conversations, or what are some of your ideas about empathetic conversations in large groups? That's the question.
That's a great question. Wow. I'm just going to punt and give it to Margie Nauta, who teaches our group psychology class. I'm just kidding, Margie. But Margie actually teaches a group psychology class. And, I think there's a group dynamic, which you can sort of get a sense of what's going on in this group, which is an organism, which is kind of, greater than the sum of its parts. Maybe the group has a certain feel, so you can sort of, get a pulse of that. But it's also making choices about who in a group you're going to empathize with. And those choices are tough, but it has to be based on your values and what you're wanting. So let's say, you've got several students of color. You can make a choice to do the mental simulation of what they're experiencing and to organize the discussion as though their voices are the most important ones in the room. And so sometimes that could guide your discussions, it could guide what you reflect and what you restate. And there might be other students who are more skeptical. And then you have to make a choice. Do I empathize and reflect and restate those things as much, because that's going to encourage the group to go in that direction? Or do I say, you know what, for the sake of students who might be more vulnerable, I'm going to make a choice about who I empathize with. And I think that's one of the things that happens in groups, is you can't empathize with everybody at the same time. We just don't have that capability. So no magic answer. But I think there's a group dynamic, which you can sort of see where that's going. But the reflections, the restatements, I think all those things still apply in a group setting. And particularly with tough conversations, that's sometimes the best thing you can do, because you don't need to weigh in and direct the conversation. You can simply restate or reflect what you're hearing, which holds a mirror up not only to that student, but to the rest of the class, so they can sort of see what's going on. Great question.
Hey, Nathan, can I ask a question?
Please do, Dr. Craig.
I couldn't find the raise your hand thing for some reason. So, Doc, I have a question for you.
Sure.
If you were training now, let's say, right now, I think we're going to be a nation in a lot of turmoil over the next few weeks, right? So we have the outcome, we're awaiting the outcome of the George Floyd article. Not George Floyd trial, sorry, Dan Chauvin trial. We just found out that Jacob Blake's, the officer who shot him, is back on the force now, right? So I think we're going to see a lot of, and I know we are personally, we're going to see a lot of Black trauma coming, right? And I'm going to kind of go off Jillian's question here a little bit. What would you say, I mean, if you're training people who are coming on, and we're talking about empathy now, right? What would you say might be the most important thing to think about as we're going through all of this, and we're going to be coming out of it, and we know it's going to continue happening, right? And I know people who are personally just traumatized beyond belief. And I wonder, will we want to deal with, will empathy be something that's important? And what I'm really trying to get to is, let me be sensitive here, is will empathy from white people work with Black people who are, and people of color, right? And women who are dealing with these issues right now? What would be the best thing that you might tell people you're training right now who are, who might be stepping into this? I hope the question makes sense.
I think so. There's a lot to it. Well, let me see if I can unpack it. Basically, what should we tell white people to do? Is that kind of?
Well, really, yeah, that's part of it. But
yeah,
I guess I'm interested in the training for this as well, right? I mean, this could be, how can Black folk be more, have this, be more have more empathy also in these conversations, because they're going to be difficult conversations, right? So
yeah.
Well,
I mean, I think one of the problems is when people assume that they have the other person figured out. And that could be for a white person trying to understand a Black person, or for a Black person trying to understand another Black person. A lot of times I think that confidence can be more of a problem with people sometimes who are similar demographically, because particularly the assumptions are easier to make. So let's say someone with your same religion says, oh, I'm struggling with blah, blah, blah. I was like, oh, well, God tells you this. Like it's easier to make the assumption that I understand what it's like to be in your shoes. And hopefully one of the things that I hope I can convey is that to do this takes a lot of work. To actually empathize requires skill, it requires self-knowledge, it requires social, emotional skill, and it requires micro skills of doing restatements, having people correct you to make sure that you're actually getting what they're saying, asking good questions, summarizing well. It's not something that you can just assume you pick up on. And so I would tell my trainees, put in the work. Assume that anyone you meet, or I should say, don't assume that anyone you meet, you automatically understand. So I think that's important. Just for fun, I'm going to share my screen again, if that's okay. Here's some of my pet peeves or what do I call them? Less than helpful tendencies I've seen. These are the things to avoid, right? Thinking about your response rather than listening to what the other person is saying. Failing to provide feedback that you're listening. This can be a huge one. If you don't know what to do, at least look at the person. At least acknowledge that you're listening. Give them some ahas or something. Trying to get the other person to look on the bright side. This is something I think could be really damaging with some of these difficulties, that especially the traumatic experiences. What's on the bright side? We are making progress. Like, come on, really? Just don't do that. don't do the look on the bright side stuff. It's invalidating. Providing a religious interpretation of a circumstance, I'd say generally that's not helpful. It's a big risk. You'll hear a lot of that. Obviously, I told you so is never helpful. Somehow making the conversation about you, can be also tough. So someone shares a difficult experience, and rather than letting them sit there, talking about your own experience, often not as helpful. I'm guilty of this one a lot. Changing the subject or disengaging. So just kind of ignoring the subject or moving on to something nicer. That's less than helpful. Trying to problem solve, that's a big one. I think problem solving is like the empathy killer, because it kind of says, I've got you all figured out and I'm ready to fix you. And so close-ended questions can especially be tough, like, have you tried? This is one of my least favorite questions I see new helpers use, which is they say like, oh, well, have you tried? And it's like, the assumption should always be they're smart enough to think of some stuff. So you don't need to say, have you tried? Why don't you say, what's it been like when you've tried different things? So that's a tough question. And then, of course, interrupting and finishing sentence and arguing. So I just thought I'd throw those in there because those might provide some pitfalls to avoid as we're entering into tough conversations and trying to listen without judging and that sort of thing. So Byron, I don't know if I got at what you were getting at, or how you might change my answer, or things you might find important to add.
No, I think that was really helpful. Just because, I really want to know how to have these, to show that and to be empathetic during these conversations. Because we are moving into tough times with these conversations, right? Mm-hmm. And I want to always make sure that I'm available mm-hmm. and I'm present in these conversations, because it would be very easy for me to hear the wrong thing and completely zone out from that person and just push them away through my looks and my actions. And where I am now in my life, I don't want to do that. I want to be open to, not to say I'm going to deal with foolishness, right? Right. Insulting. But, for someone who wants to really be there and learn and understand, I want to make sure that I can listen. I mean, it's really helpful. I'm giving a talk on Thursday to a social media and marketing group. And what I'm going to be talking about is a little bit different than what I think they think I'm going to talk about. Is going to be pretty hard hitting. And so one of the things that I'm going to have to be aware of is how people are looking at me while I'm presenting. And I don't want to have any action that turns them off from what I'm trying to say. And when they start asking questions, I want to make sure that, and I really like the whole idea of kind of like repeating back. I actually love that. That's one of the things that I'm really going to take to heart with this, right? And I think that can help with any of these kind of hard conversations that are going to be coming up in the next few months. So yeah. No, I appreciate it. I'm learning from you, Doc. Learning.
Well, good luck with your talk on Thursday.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and go ahead, Scott.
Again, so Dan, my next question is an and question. Throughout your talk, you mentioned the difficulties of expressing empathy. And I wonder how much in the adult world it feels that way. Mm. And I wonder how much of that is an artifact of cultural developmental factors that lead us to have these well-honed in-group, out-group dynamics where we unconsciously extend our empathy in certain in-group, out-group ways that's fully supported by an infrastructure that keeps us by some people in a way. And what I'm getting at is, if the culture were different, I'm not sure empathy would be as difficult as it feels like for adults, because I think children are actually pretty naturally resonant to the emotions of others. So I'm just wondering, this idea of, might our difficulty with empathy be more a cultural artifact than a sort of natural property of what it means to be human?
Well, I mean, I think biologically we've got lots of the building blocks for being empathetic, your mirror neurons and sophisticated brains and bodies. And I think kids are good at resonating with other emotions. I wouldn't necessarily say they're always great at empathy, though. I think good empathy is sophisticated. I think sometimes as adults, we lose our ability to resonate with others. And there's some literature that the more power people have in society, the less they demonstrate empathy. Probably because it gets out of practice. You don't need it. You don't need it if you're in power. Do I need to empathize with my peons? Because, it's like, no, they work for me. They do what I say. They should empathize with me so they know, know what they need to, how they need to grovel, I guess. So I think there are some things in our culture which make it difficult. I think asynchronous communication's tough, particularly text messaging. How do you empathize with someone over text? They tell you something sad. Like, what's a good empathetic response? Like, we haven't developed sophisticated social norms for how to do that. It feels weird to restate it. Like, I had a bad day. Sounds like you had a bad day. That's a weird text message, right? Or you give a sad emoji. That kind of seems like a little trite. It's really hard to empathize over text message. And so I think sometimes people can be used to not getting that feedback. And, I think you can get out of practice if the technology is that way. I haven't seen research on this either, but I'm guessing there's some chemicals or something going on when you're with someone in person, which elicit that sort of resonance better than if you're doing it over a screen or over the phone.
Oxytocin.
Yeah. Could you say more about that, or?
No, it's a chemical that's very much associated with what do I want to say? Sense of connection, sense of concern for others. The data are pretty robust, and of course, in an environment, until we build oxytocin dispensers in our computers, we are removing that aspect of real-time communication. Thanks for your answer, Dan. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
And there's a follow-up question in the chat from Eros, who asks, in this fast-paced technological environment with kids being constantly wired to their gadgets, are we creating a culture of the unempathetic?
That's a great question. That'd be a hard study to pull off. One of the things we know is that over the last 30 years, teens and young adults have been becoming more narcissistic, with some pretty sophisticated longitudinal studies. That's been shown, and we know that narcissism is linked to lower empathy. So in terms of sussing out the contributions of technology and that sort of thing, I think it's possible. I think we need to test it out before we draw any conclusions. I think there's certain aspects which might be strengthened by technology, though. Like their imaginative abilities might be strengthened because they have to fill in so many gaps that they don't have to in person. So I mean, it could be pros and cons. I don't know enough to give a empirically supported answer, but it's worth looking into.
Hey, well, so I know. I mean, I think that's a good question, but I wonder. I think we, as well as looking at, kids with gadgets, I also think, I tend to kind of believe Plato's kind of comments about the more educated we are, the less empathetic we become, right? And I'm just saying that to get a reaction from you to see what you think about that. Is that something do you think that's something that really happens? And of course well, I'll let you respond to it.
So was the question is the more educated we are, the less empathetic we become?
Yeah. Are we less inclined to be compassionate, right? As we become more educated, do our smarts block us from having empathy, right? And it's an old notion, but I wonder if there's any, truth to it. I believe you have a background in philosophy, right?
Yeah, I read some Plato over the years, long time ago. I don't know if it's our smarts that get in the way, or if it's some of the extra baggage that comes along with thinking you're smart, that gets in the way. Because I have met some really humble, wonderful academics. They're not all horrible, so I mean, sometimes you can see like a confluence of all sorts of wonderful virtues coming together in someone who dedicates their life to their mind, but also to their heart and other aspects of their life as well. Where sometimes their mind can complement their heart and make them more effective as a helper, rather than sort of, make them arrogant or know-it-alls or things like that. So I don't know. I would guess the more learned you become, the more you trust in your ability to figure things out. And I could see that confidence in being able to figure things out being an actual hindrance to actually understanding people. Yeah. So Eros had a follow-up question. Our sense of community is being eroded. This might contribute to greater dependency on therapists for what should naturally be met through connections to one's community. Boy, that is so true, isn't it? A sense of community is hard for people. Yeah. I mean, in some ways, therapists are becoming like the new priests, right? People lacking a sense of guidance, how do I make sense of life? What do I do here?
If I could follow up with a quick question on that, coupling Eros's question about, are we losing our empathy because we're not with each other in particular spaces? I completely understand this idea of connection, and what I'd like to end with that is that when we're in these connected social relationships, it's not all empathy. We get mad at each other. We get mad at the people we're close to because we're so much more emotionally dependent on them than we are strangers. So when we say we're losing our community, our connection, I would agree with that. But I would add that doesn't mean that when we're all together, we're all happy with each other, right? That what we're losing is intimacy, and that's not always about being nice. Just throw that out there.
Right. Connection sometimes involves conflict. And you can't have sometimes you can't have deep connections with people unless they've rubbed you the wrong way and you've come to an understanding afterwards. It's like when tectonic plates come together, there's bound to be a few earthquakes.
Oh, and it looks like we have a question. I see a hand raised.
You're not Lori, though, are you, Ray?
Go right ahead, Ray.
Oh, I think you're muted.
Little button there. Okay. One of the things that often comes up in talking about empathy, and you heard it with Brene Brown, is like kind of a dissing of empathy, of sympathy. Historically, we always thought sympathy was a good thing. You feel sympathy when somebody loses a loved one. So what's your take on do you think sympathy is admittedly, it's different than empathy. But do you think it's, as Brene Brown seemed to be saying, it's a bad thing?
I think I dare not criticize the great Brene. In fact, some I've had clients where I'll like get to the end of the therapy, and I'll be like, I've been like, what was some of the most what was some of the most helpful things we've done in here? Thinking like they'll think of something I did, and they're like, oh, it was the Brene Brown video you showed. That was humbling. So all that said, now I'm going to criticize Brene Brown. I do think she mischaracterizes sympathy a little bit, because sympathy is more of, the way I've read the definitions of it, is an effective reaction to another person. And so she was kind of characterizing it as like the lack of an effective reaction to another person, or sort of like a disconcern. But in actuality, it could be like, oh, I'm feeling really sad for you, which is different than feeling sad with you. Sometimes you can't feel with them, sometimes you feel for them. And I, having been on the receiving end of sympathy, I have to say, sometimes I like it. Other times I don't like it, but it depends on who it is. And it depends on how, how secure I feel in what I'm feeling. Sometimes it can feel a little patronizing, or like they're pitying you. And I think that's probably what she's going for. That sometimes with sympathy, it can be like the person is putting themselves at a higher pedestal and looking down on you, rather than looking at you like an equal.
Quickly, before we bring to, Dr. Craig is going to say something about the upcoming talks. Dan, I'm wondering if you have access to the chat. Dr. Nauta put something in there. You typed a response, but I thought it might be useful to actually
say it out loud.
Give you the opportunity to address it with.
Yeah. So she wrote, Dr. Oh, there she is. Actually, how about you just say it, since you say it better than I would.
Oh, I was just kind of reacting, I think, with Eris, you were wondering if we might be sort of as a culture moving away from empathy, but I saw this really neat video with adolescents who were in therapy, and a therapist just asked a question at the end, kind of as a wrap up, who in the group really understood you? And the adolescents are really good at giving feedback to each other. One of them had become kind of tearful, and in response, someone else in the group became tearful. And so the one adolescent was talking about how, when I saw someone else crying, I knew that they understood what it was like for me. And they're just really good at being able to kind of tell each other, here's what you did that made me feel understood. And I think that's very encouraging.
It's a beautiful thing when you see kids or adults like get each other and feel stuff with each other.
There we go. Okay, so I guess we're done with questions and stuff. This is a great conversation. Dan, thank you so much. So I want to talk about our next two programs coming up. And I believe the next one is the first one. The next one, April 27th, with Dean Diane Zosky. She'll give her talk on extending empathy with the perpetrators of intimate partner violence. Again, that's on Tuesday, April 27th, 7 to 8:30 p.m. And you see the link there. And then on Tuesday, May 4th, same time, 7 to 8:30 p.m., we'll have Dr. Teresa Rojas, who's in the English department, professor of English, professor of ethnic studies at Modesto Junior College. And the name of her talk is, I don't see it here.
Oh, it's narrative and empathy
narrative
training.
and empathy training. There we go. That's my seasoned eyes, folks. Sorry about that. Yeah, narrative is empathy training. And again, that'll be on Tuesday, May 4th, from 7 to 8:30 p.m. And you'll see the link is there as well. And Scott?
Thanks to everyone for coming this evening. Thank you, Dr. Lannin, for a fantastic talk and an amazingly open conversation. And we hope to see you at our remaining colloquia. Thank you and have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Nathan, are we still live on YouTube?